Good afternoon, colleagues. We are all teachers and researchers, and I'm sure I'm not going to surprise anyone here when I say the very best part of our job is collaboration. Academia doesn't have many joys, but when you find, well, you know what I'm talking about, but when you find someone that you can work well with, who sparks your passion for research, who helps you build ideas and fuels your energy for future projects, you really can have a lot of fun in this field. Our speaker tonight, Professor Alexandra Darcy, is that kind of person to me. So let me tell you just a little bit about her. Alex did her BA at the University of British Columbia on the far west coast of Canada. She moved to the very eastern part of the country to do her MA at the Memorial University in St. John's, Newfoundland. Then she decided to move inland to Toronto to do her PhD, which happened to be the same year I moved back to Canada from England to take up a job at the University of Toronto. And in a very lucky twist of fate that we could probably tell you about later at the cocktail party, Alex chose me to be her supervisor. Now, maybe some of you out there in the crowd can guess what happened next. Alex and I launched into a series of studies on one of the most reviled and infamous features in contemporary linguistics, the quotative be-like. Now, at the same time, Alex and I produced quite a few other studies of much less reviled linguistic phenomena, but Alex was so intrigued by the non-standard uses of like that she bravely set out to study it in her dissertation, undaunted by the naysayers who tried to dissuade her by telling her it was a passing fancy. Boy, were they wrong. As we know, the study of like has become a veritable industry in our field. Just as she was completing her dissertation, Alex was shortlisted for a choice entry-level position at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. She borrowed my lucky black briefcase and off she went, and she got that job. In 2010, she returned to Canada to the University of Victoria. By 2018, she was a full professor, but she didn't stop there. In 2019, she became Associate Dean of Research. In 2024, Acting Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, and she is now Associate Vice President of Research and Innovation. Which kind of makes you wonder how on earth she gets her own research done, right? But she does. Perhaps some of you in the audience may have read one or two of her papers, or maybe her book, 800 Years of Like, or maybe you've heard her in one of her many online interviews, which you can find on the internet. But in my personal opinion, Alex is one of those people that you really have to see in person. Because when she talks about her research, it is infectiously inspirational. She always has a well-argued story to tell, and you never leave the room wondering what the heck she was talking about. So hold on to your seats, sit back, you are in for a treat. Among her many research activities, Alex has chosen to tell us today about findings arising from her latest project on how preschool and early elementary children acquire language. Please join me in welcoming Alex to the podium.
I'm sort of tempted to say Sally always makes me cry, but given how that introduction started, that would probably come off the wrong way. Sally's done a lot of good things for me. So as I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Lekwungen and the Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land on which the University of Victoria stands continue to this day. I'm just really fortunate to work and live and play where I do. I'm also really very honored and happy to be here today. And I'd like to thank the conference organizers, not only for this invitation, but for all the work they've done to make this meeting such an incredible success. So thank you for your generous hospitality to us all. There are ways in which this presentation today has been in the making for most of my research career. I think, especially after that intro, that many of you would associate me with my work on the many uses of like, which Sally Tagliamonte once described as having taken a hold of me and never letting go. She's probably not wrong. Like, is she ever? But another taking hold was happening in parallel, and that's the notion of the child as linguistic historian, the title and subject of Lebov's paper in the inaugural issue of Language Variation and Change. I learned about this paper about 21 years ago, and it captivated me from the outset. The reality of longitudinal variable continuity is actually really intriguing. But it becomes all the more so, I think, when we start to grapple not only with continuity, but also with longitudinal variable change. So here we go. Well, I wasn't clicking through. What fun. Here we are now. So certainly these facts of language, how it works, how it's structured, how it's designed from the lenses of systemic and systematic variability and change, they were important concepts to me as I worked to demonstrate that like, in all of its uses and functions, has constrained variable grammars, and that these are structured and meaningful and probabilistic and historically embedded. So that's why these kinds of patterns that I have up on the screen here, with all of their symmetry and parallelism, are so exciting to me and also so intriguing to me. So no matter function or frequency or speaker year of birth, the grammar is the grammar is the grammar. And this is just my work. You'll see the same thing, as you know, for like in the Be Like quotative construction, or for example, in Marissa Brooks' work on like as a complementizer. And of course, that's because like, remember that I said this, okay? It's because like just isn't special. Yeah? And what I mean by that is that we've been observing this kind of symmetry and contextual conditioning since some of the most classic works in our field, whether in apparent time or in real time. And so we agree that current states of language represent ongoing and continuous change and development. And we also agree that this continuous change and development leaves both footprints from earlier stages across synchronic practice, as well as, potentially, indicators of future possible states. The result, then, is that we get synchronic variation that continues to be constrained by diachronic factors. And of course, the classic example of this from Lebov's '89 paper, in fact, is variable ing. So as we all know, to this day, the source constructions of what's now word final variable ing are not only probabilistically encoded in production values, but they hold across world Englishes. When I talk to non-linguists about ing, usually because I'm trying to talk them down from some fairly pejorative beliefs of what it means to say jump in instead of jumping, people are generally pretty amazed, right? So non-linguists are blown away by these facts that we take to be so mundane, so not worth talking about, because this is just how language works to us, right? But I actually don't want you to lose your sense of wonder when you think about this and what this means and how this might happen. Generation after generation after generation after generation after generation after generation after generation, in place to place to place to place to place. Because the thing is, it's facts like these that led Labov to declare that children inherit the history of a language as they learn it, which means ultimately that we're reproducing history when we use language. And maybe, in a way, that's the whole point of this presentation. We reproduce the history of a language, both in its stable elements and its changing ones, and that is astonishingly wonderful. But it's also, frankly, just plain astonishing. So I guess what I'm saying is that Labov's point is anything but mundane, and I stress this because it's actually a really easy point to take for granted, just as the fact that language change itself is so much of a given that we don't even list it among the assumptions of our work. Right? We just take it for granted that language changes. And ultimately, where I'd like to poke a bit is at those stubborn and difficult assimilations of language as reflected in the history of a language. And the place to do this, of course, is with those who are most responsible for advancing change, the perfect historians of language themselves. The framing of children as perfect historians is reflected in historical accounts more generally, such that system internal evolution is described as the preservation of the unbroken sequences of native language acquisition by children, which results in the transmission of the structural detail of adult language generation after generation after generation. These facts render all language historical residue. Children then learn, acquire, and master this residue in conversational or interactional contexts, those places where language lives and breathes. So I'm going to work with this today, and this is where I'm coming from, but because of that, I feel compelled to point out a few things. The first is that evolutionary change as currently understood assumes linguistic continuity and stability. And what I mean is that it accounts only for languages and acquisitional environments that are unbroken and in which children from the outset acquire a language as a home or communal language. The second is that all theory that builds out from this assumption necessarily accounts only for those language circumstances that meet the definition. We have yet to fully engage with a theory of evolutionary change that also applies when these circumstances are not met or when they are met by alternative circumstances. And finally, it's really embedded in spoken language. Modality hasn't yet factored into variationist theorizing about transmission and its ramifications for ongoing language change, and I can't help but feel that this is a non-trivial gap. These are considerations for a different day, but I wanted to acknowledge them rather than simply gloss over them. What I ultimately intend to argue today is two things. One, ongoing language change is an integral part of the historical residue that children not only have to contend with as part of transmission, then they also have to actively engage with it as part of their linguistic mastery. And two, children's unambiguous success as linguistic historians supports an understanding of variation, and thus an understanding of change, not only as basic design features of language, but also as features with beneficial outcomes for language learners and users alike. And I'd really love to see this last part of it built into our evolutionary models of system internal change. Sally and I began to grapple with some of this in our 2009 paper in Language, where we started to interrogate what it means for a change to be incremented in time and in social structure, work that's increasingly being taken up by others as well. The backbone of incrementation, however, is transmission. And immediately, if we engage with transmission, the mechanism of evolutionary change, we come up against two long-held claims. The first is that our vernacular is our mother's vernacular. It's the variety that we supposedly master first. That is us, the child, being a perfect historian, reflecting the unbroken sequence of native language acquisition. And there's long-standing evidence showing that young children are pretty good at pattern matching their parents. The second is somewhat contradictory because the first one isn't actually true. It's not the case that our vernacular now is our mother's vernacular, or at least it can't remain a replica of our mother's vernacular because a non-trivial amount of language change is axiomatically dependent on children actually learning to talk differently from their mothers. That is, the only way that language change can actually be a thing is through some form of imperfect replication, which we now talk about as vernacular reorganization, which involves children successfully tapping into unstable variability. This is when the shift happens between replication via transmission to incrementation via reorganization. And to do that, children take whatever vernacular system they learned initially and they modify it. That really starts to happen when they increasingly engage with peer influence, living and breathing the language of those with whom they seek affiliation, approval, and belonging, while also distancing themselves from those with whom they do not. And when understood this way, we're right back at the beginning with Weinreich et al. The grammars in which linguistic change occurs are grammars of the speech community. Replication actually provides insight to this. We know that a critical period is about the age of 4 years, by which time children have been shown to have acquired not only categorical and variable stable features, but also those involved in change. And at this age, children closely mirror their caregivers, right? So typically women. That's why we talk about moms. In fact, there's a large body of work on the acquisition of sociolinguistic variation, not just in English, but cross-linguistically. This work shows us, for example, that stylistic ability is observable starting around age 3, so we see the use of standard variants in more formal language contexts than we do in informal ones. Also, from about age 3, children from higher SES families produce more standard variants than children from lower SES families do. And use of standard forms is more frequent in caregiver speech to little girls than it is in that speech to little boys. And this is where things start to get really interesting, I think. This set of results is from folks Doherty and Watt, who examine realizations of voiceless alveolar T in child-directed speech in Tyneside. What you see here are the differences in medial position, so we're talking words like, for me, water, winter, and bottle, between speech directed to little girls in gray, those gray bars, and speech directed to little boys, the black bars. And crucially, the standard realization, so that voiceless alveolar stop, is much more frequent in speech to girls. And the non-standard realizations, and those glottalized variants in particular, are much more frequent in speech to boys. And I've reported the same thing in my own data for a range of features using the Kids Talk corpus, which is a collection of longitudinal recordings from 14 families in Victoria, with data from 15 mums, 5 dads, and 18 children, recorded every 4 months between 2017 and 2021. So this example here is for adjectives of positivity, an active semantic category that's currently undergoing fairly rapid and wide-scale lexical redistribution. So this features an interesting one because it enables us to look at innovation, declination, stability, and gender effects all at once. So, take cool. This adjective is increasing really quickly in Victoria, and this change is led by women. And the moms have clearly clocked that on some level. You can see for yourselves that this is their #1 adjective of positivity in child-directed speech, but the mums of boys use it significantly more frequently than do the mums of girls. Did I get that right? I feel like I got that wrong. Oh no, I got it right. Okay. In fact, their variant of choice is intensified good, a nice solid, conservative variant that's used more frequently by women in the community. So in other words, these moms are doing a very good job. You get that? Intensified good. Right? The moms are doing a very good job of modeling for their girls how to be really good at conforming to linguistic expectations. And there's lots of other gendering that's going on here too. So for example, little girls get to hear much more amazing, used more by women in Victoria. Lovely, a clearly gendered form, and used more by women in Victoria. And awesome, a change led by women in Victoria. And all of this is strongly suggestive that child-directed speech isn't only about the patterns of use in terms of the variable forms themselves and which one is or isn't selected, but also about the ways in which variants are contextually embedded and socialized. So I'm thinking here about Eckert's work on linguistic practice as a socio-symbolic representation of group membership or identity, where men's language and women's language each reflects a style that characterizes gender groups. What we see here then nicely illustrates that gender-based stylization is something in which we're acculturated as members of a community, right? So girls hear about cool vintage dresses, and boys hear about cool toys and cool karate chops. And so then this takes us to the community itself and the ways in which what happens in the home may or may not reflect what's happening outside the home. And if it's the case that transmission is about replication of community constraints and vectors, then we'd expect to see this reflected in child-directed speech. There are clear indications, however, that the two aren't matched. In Folks et al., there are clear frequency differences between child-directed speech, right, so that bar on the very left-hand side, and adult speech. Sorry, child-directed speech are the two on the right, and adult speech is the one on the left. As you see here, use of glottal variants, the white sections, was significantly less frequent among both men and women in child-directed speech than it was in inter-adult speech. And in contrast, use of the standard alveolar stop variant in black was markedly more frequent in speech to children than it was among adults. And we see the same thing again in the kids' talk corpus, both in lexical semantics and in morphosemantics, or morphosyntax. So in these figures, men's data are at the top, women's data are at the bottom. The blue bars display the overall frequency of each variant in the matched community cohort. So what I mean is adults of the same age of the parents of the children. And then the child-directed speech of dads is in purple, and the child-directed speech of moms is in green. So for adjectives of positivity on the left, we can see just how unified mums and dads are in the way they shift the frequencies of individual adjectives. In this sense, they're perfectly parallel in their performative patterns, right? So mums and dads are doing the same thing in the same way when they're talking to kids at home. So both promote cool and good above their community peer baselines, both increase awesome a titch, and both pull back on great and amazing. The same thing is evident with the modals of necessity on the right of the slide, where the distributional patterns across community and child-directed speech are both distinct from one language context to the next, and yet they're also, again, perfectly matched between mums and dads. And again, the incoming form, in this case need to, is much more frequent in child-directed speech than it is in the community. So all in all, two things are clear. One, sociolinguistic performance in child-directed speech is quite distinct from what's going on outside the home, but, and this isn't trivial, this distinction nonetheless reflects longitudinal trends that operate at the community level. And crucially, it's these home vectors that children acquire, not the community ones. In other words, in frequency terms, they're acquiring a later stage of change. This is Smith and Holmes-Elliott's analysis of glottal replacement, so again, going back to that T, in Buckie, Scotland. As is now familiar, the caregiver rates of glottal use are lower than our overall community rates. And here, they have additional data from the young children too, where, just as in Milton Keynes, the child rates have a similar mean to that of caregivers. In fact, the two are very closely correlated at the level of individual child and caregiver, as shown on the figure on the right. So the generalization here then is that if mom uses a lot of glottal stops, their child does too, and vice versa. So this tells us that in terms of frequency of variance, what happens in the home is not the same as what happens in the community, and children are very good at not only tuning into this, but also at replicating it. That's transmission, but I think we may want to think of it as transmission plus, since community on the one hand and caregivers and their children on the other are not matched. So instead, child-directed speech seems to show the way forward, modeling a more innovative grammar than what's currently found in adult language, while also promoting standard forms. As summarized so perfectly by Julie Roberts, children manage to hit a moving target during the acquisition-transmission phase, acquiring not only the language, but all of its variable elements, both stable and unstable. Given then that the home sociolinguistic ecology models both stable sociolinguistic variation and advanced models of community-level change, it's really tempting to suggest that the direction and momentum children require to shift from a transmitted system to an incremented system is provided directly as part of acquisition. Under this interpretation, then, the scene is set for incrementation, where historical residue is transformed into ongoing change. Of course, it's well known that child-directed speech is modified from community speech in a number of respects. This typically involves things like simplified syntax and vocabulary, shorter utterances, multiple repetitions, use of a wide pitch range, use of slow speaking rate, longer pause durations. The reasons why this may be the case typically center on potential functions of speech to children as learning facilitation. So for example, those that function analytically potentially help children to figure out linguistic structures. So these ones simplify or clarify the input, so slowing down and repeating things may help a child locate words in a stream of speech, possibly supporting long-term acquisition. Others, on the other hand, may be social, supporting the initiation and maintenance of interaction. So here, for example, wider pitch ranges may help to gain and hold a child's attention, helping them to learn that speech is a social, interactive activity. So while child-directed speech might help in language learning, caregivers seem to adapt their speech primarily to enable communication with children who are not yet in possession of a fully elaborated linguistic knowledge. That some elements of child-directed speech have social functions, even socialization functions, that caregivers use more standard, stable forms more frequently in child-directed speech, and that they also calibrate incoming or innovative forms to the developing gender identity of their child, all indicate that caregivers model regular and salient sociolinguistic variability, laying the foundation within the ecology of transmission that pre-adolescence and adolescence can then activate through incrementation. But this early input, it's not sufficient on its own, right? So what I mean is that transmission doesn't set the scene for automation of incrementation. Rather, the switch from transmission to incrementation crucially relies on young speakers engaging in and learning from peer interaction and peer socialization. As Chevreau notes, children construct an abstract language system early on, whose outputs later interact with social cognition developed in parallel. Rather than noise to be eliminated, language-related social information actively helps children structure the variability of their environment. I would argue that age-related vectors of change are part of this social information, along with other socially cued elements of variation, such as gender, socioeconomic status, and so on. And so it's this notion of variability in the environment that I'd like to touch on before concluding today. In a recent set of work, Benedict and his colleagues have been poking at the status of variation as either a bug or an intentional and productive design feature. This work crucially interrogates the idea that variation or optionality in grammar is somehow dysfunctional and thus suboptimal. I mean, here it is, okay. So that we see variation evident from the outset in child language, not strictly as part of general learning strategies, but as reflective of longitudinal communal trends, and sometimes with very deep roots in the history of a language, is strongly suggestive that variation, in the sense of speakers having options for how to encode functions and meanings, is baked into structure, right? So it's systemic, in other words. I have always believed that. And yet, there are theoretical stances in which optionality is considered suboptimal and best understood as transitional. So belief alone is probably not enough. Like, believe me, I would like to just be right. But if we bring in the science, we can think of complexity in at least two ways. Measures of absolute complexity focus on the complexity of system inherent structures, so things like counting the number of contrastive elements in a system. Well, by definition, variation increases absolute complexity. And this is because form-function asymmetry necessarily means that there are more forms in the grammar. But there are also measures of relative complexity. These ones focus on user complexity and evaluate system inherent properties as they relate to a language user, such as how hard or difficult it is to use a particular language or language variety compared to others. Well, as Benedict and others outline, it's less clear how optionality or sociolinguistic variability relates to relative complexity. The relevant questions here are things like, does having to select a variant among a set of variants make production of the content harder? And if it does, we'd expect to find evidence of disfluency whenever optionality or the need for choice were manifested. And this is because grammatical optionality could be cognitively burdensome. As we know, variation is not simply about selecting a given variant to encode a particular meaning or function. It's probabilistically constrained by any number of contextual factors that operate at the same time. These are both social and linguistic, and they themselves can be quite complex, and they often differ in relative weight in terms of effect size. Despite all of this, there's no evidence of any demonstrable difficulty for speakers to manage variability, whether in terms with more grammatical optionality contexts or in optionality contexts that putatively demand more cognitive effort. And alternations governed by more internal constraints and or alternations with more variants to choose from do not co-occur with more disfluencies. What this work argues in a nutshell is that we'd expect disfluency as a measure of production difficulty to correlate with relative complexity if structured variation were suboptimal. It does not. The summary then is that variation may increase absolute complexity, but it does not appear to increase relative complexity. This leads Benedict and colleagues to the principle of optionality, which states that languages and language users favor the availability of different ways of saying the same thing. In other words, optionality is optimal. Yes, ma'am. All right, so this is because there are benefits, they argue, to variation. Benefits that improve or enhance online fluency in production, and these benefits compensate for any cognitive demands of variability. So for example, the structural presence of variation as a fundamental design principle aids speakers to adjust explicitness, to manage information density, to communicate efficiently, to achieve rhythmic well-formedness, to stall for planning time, and so on. Like, this is going to end up being a really, really long list if you take into account all of the variability that we have. And these benefits operate in conversational and interactional contexts, the sites of language transmission. So returning to the argument from Fowkes et al. That I noted earlier, if young children are not yet in possession of a fully elaborated linguistic knowledge, then it seems likely, entirely likely, that the same benefits of variation that operate on adult language will also facilitate both acquisition and transmission. In fact, if we consider analytic aspects of child-directed speech, those that simplify or clarify the input to help children figure out structure, then variation that adjusts explicitness or manages information density will be beneficial during transmission. Similarly, those aspects of child-directed speech that support speech as an interactive activity will be well supported by variation that affects rhythm or communicative effectiveness. I mean, even if we consider variation that is socially rich, like cool karate chops versus cool vintage dresses, then variation during transmission shares all of that social information and all of that linguistic information that can then be activated during incrementation as part of a now fully elaborated socio-linguistic knowledge. In that sense, then, I suggest that part of the reason why children are such effective historians of language is because they have access to variation, whether stable or part of an ongoing change, and not in spite of it. Thank you.